They say rain washes everything clean. They say it purifies, renews, gives the earth a fresh start. And perhaps for most people that's true. Perhaps for most people, rain is just rainwater falling from the sky, tapping against rooftops, filling up gutters, and sliding off umbrellas held by people who have somewhere warm to go. But not for Linda Cray. For Linda, rain was the sound of her heart breaking on a sidewalk outside a restaurant she could barely afford. It was the taste of mascara running into the corners of her mouth. It was the cold, soaking fabric of a $12 dress clinging to her skin, while the man she'd loved for 4 years climbed into a German sedan and drove away without once, not once, looking in his rearview mirror. Rain didn't wash anything clean for Linda. It just made sure the whole world could see her crying. Kevin had picked the restaurant, a place with cloth napkins and tiny portions and a wine list longer than her rent agreement. She should have known then. Should have read the signs the way you read a warning label on something poisonous. But love makes you stupid. Love makes you sit across from a man in a $400 suit and smile like you belong there, even when your shoes are from a thrift store and your nails are done at home with a $3 bottle from the corner shop. He didn't even wait for dessert. "Linda," he'd said, folding his napkin like he was about to deliver a quarterly report. "You're a maid. I'm a VP now. It doesn't work." She'd blinked, smiled even, because surely he was joking. Surely the man who'd eaten her cooking every night for 4 years, who'd slept in her bed, who'd whispered, "You're my girl," against her neck in the dark. Surely he wasn't sitting in this overpriced restaurant, under these golden chandeliers, telling her she wasn't good enough. But he was. "There's someone else," he'd continued, like he was reading a script he'd rehearsed. She fits the life I'm building. She's expecting. Expecting. The word hit her like a slap. Not a punch. A slap. The kind that stings more because it's personal, because it's deliberate, because it's meant to humiliate, not to wound. He'd left cash on the table, not enough for the bill, she later realized, and walked out. She'd followed him to the curb like a fool, rain hammering down on them both, and he'd turned to her one last time. Not with cruelty. Worse. With pity. "You'll be fine, Linda. You're resilient. Like she was a cockroach. Like surviving was a compliment and not an insult wrapped in tissue paper. He'd driven off. She'd stood there. And the rain had done what rain does to people. Nobody is coming back for it. Soaked her straight through to the bone. That was 3 months ago. At least, that's what Linda told herself. 3 months. 90-something days. A neat, countable number that made it sound like she was healing, like she was moving on, like time was doing its job. But time hadn't done a thing. Time had just changed the scenery. Because now, instead of standing in the rain outside a restaurant, Linda was kneeling on a marble staircase inside a mansion so large and so silent that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Her knees ached against the cold stone, a rag in one hand, Polish in the other, a black dress with a white collar and cuffs, a white frilled apron tied too tight around her waist, her hair pulled back in a bun so severe it tugged at her temples. She was still a maid. Kevin had been right about that much. But this wasn't an ordinary house, and the man who owned it was not an ordinary employer. The Joe estate sat on 20 acres of manicured silence at the edge of the city, hidden behind iron gates and a reputation that made taxi drivers refuse the fare. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, a Korean woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that never blinked, had given Linda exactly 2 rules on her first day. Never look Mr. Joe in the eye. Never enter his private study. She hadn't explained why. She hadn't needed to. The armed men standing at every doorway, the surveillance cameras that tracked you like living eyes. The way the other staff moved through the halls like ghosts, heads down, voices at a whisper, all of it said what Mrs. Park's rules only hinted at. Joe Dong-min was not a businessman. Or rather, he was. But the kind of business he conducted didn't show up on any stock exchange. Linda had heard the rumors before she'd taken the job. Everyone in the city had. The Korean man in the black suits who owned half the waterfront and all of the silence that surrounded it. The man whose enemies disappeared so quietly that even They say rain washes everything clean. They say it purifies, renews, gives the earth a fresh start. And perhaps for most people that's true. Perhaps for most people, rain is just rainwater falling from the sky, tapping against rooftops, filling up gutters, and sliding off umbrellas held by people who have somewhere warm to go. But not for Linda Cray. For Linda, rain was the sound of her heart breaking on a sidewalk outside a restaurant she could barely afford. It was the taste of mascara running into the corners of her mouth. It was the cold, soaking fabric of a $12 dress clinging to her skin, while the man she'd loved for 4 years climbed into a German sedan and drove away without once, not once, looking in his rearview mirror. Rain didn't wash anything clean for Linda. It just made sure the whole world could see her crying. Kevin had picked the restaurant. A place with cloth napkins and tiny portions, and a wine list longer than her rent agreement. She should have known then. Should have read the signs the way you read a warning label on something poisonous. But love makes you stupid. Love makes you sit across from a man in a $400 suit and smile like you belong there, even when your shoes are from a thrift store and your nails are done at home with a $3 bottle from the corner shop. He didn't even wait for dessert. "Linda," he'd said, folding his napkin like he was about to deliver a quarterly report. "You're a maid. I'm a VP now. It doesn't work." She'd blinked, smiled even. Because surely he was joking. Surely the man who'd eaten her cooking every night for 4 years, who'd slept in her bed, who'd whispered, "You're my girl," against her neck in the dark, surely he wasn't sitting in this overpriced restaurant under these golden chandeliers telling her she wasn't good enough. But he was. "There's someone else," he'd continued, like he was reading a script he'd rehearsed. She fits the life I'm building. She's expecting." Expecting. The word hit her like a slap. Not a punch. A slap. The kind that stings more because it's personal, because it's deliberate, because it's meant to humiliate, not to wound. He'd left cash on the table, not enough for the bill, she later realized, and walked out. She'd followed him to the curb like a fool, rain hammering down on them both, and he'd turned to her one last time. Not with cruelty. Worse. With pity. "You'll be fine, Linda. You're resilient. Like she was a cockroach. Like surviving was a compliment and not an insult wrapped in tissue paper." He'd driven off. She'd stood there. And the rain had done what rain does to people nobody is coming back, for it soaked her straight through to the bone. That was 3 months ago. At least, that's what Linda told herself. 3 months. 90-something days. A neat, countable number that made it sound like she was healing, like she was moving on, like time was doing its job. But time hadn't done a thing. Time had just changed the scenery. Because now, instead of standing in the rain outside a restaurant, Linda was kneeling on a marble staircase inside a mansion so large and so silent that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Her knees ached against the cold stone. A rag in one hand, Polish in the other, a black dress with a white collar and cuffs, a white frilled apron tied too tight around her waist, her hair pulled back in a bun so severe it tugged at her temples. She was still a maid. Kevin had been right about that much. But this wasn't an ordinary house, and the man who owned it was not an ordinary employer. The Joe estate sat on 20 acres of manicured silence at the edge of the city, hidden behind iron gates and a reputation that made taxi drivers refuse the fare. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, a Korean woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that never blinked, had given Linda exactly 2 rules on her first day. Never look Mr. Joe in the eye. Never enter his private study. She hadn't explained why. She hadn't needed to. The armed men standing at every doorway. The surveillance cameras that tracked you like living eyes. The way the other staff moved through the halls like ghosts. Heads down, voices at a whisper, all of it said what Mrs. Park's rules only hinted at. Joe Dongmin was not a businessman. Or rather, he was. But the kind of business he conducted didn't show up on any stock exchange. Linda had heard the rumors before she'd taken the job. Everyone in the city had. The Korean man in the black suits who owned half the waterfront and all of the silence that surrounded it. The man whose enemies disappeared so quietly that even the newspapers stopped asking questions. They called him the gentleman, which Linda had learned was the kind of nickname people gave you when your real name was too dangerous to say out loud. She should have run. Any sane person would have. But Linda Cray was 26, broke, freshly heartbroken, and sleeping in her car when the job listing appeared. Live-in position, room and board, no experience necessary. It had sounded like salvation. It had smelled like desperation. She'd taken it anyway. And now here she was, on her knees again, not on a wet sidewalk begging a man to stay, but on Italian marble, scrubbing her way through a house that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. On her third night, the sky had split open. Thunder, the kind that doesn't rumble but cracks, like God snapping a tree in half. Lightning turned the tall windows into flashbulbs, and suddenly Linda was back on that sidewalk, rain on her face, Kevin's taillights shrinking into nothing. Her hands had started shaking, her breath came in sharp little stabs. And the silver tray she'd been carrying tea service for one, because Joe Dongmin apparently took his tea at midnight, slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. The porcelain shattered. The tea spread like a dark stain across white stone. And Linda dropped to her knees to clean it up before anyone saw, her hands trembling, tears pressing against the backs of her eyes, her mouth whispering apologies to no one. That's when the shadow fell over her. She didn't look up. Mrs. Park's rules. But she could feel him. The way you feel a storm approaching before the first drop hits. The air in the hallway changed. It got heavier, colder. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence. Joe Dongmin stood above her like a monument carved from midnight. Black suit, no creases, white shirt, black tie, shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the broken porcelain at his feet. His face was unreadable, sharp, sculpted, still. His dark eyes didn't blink, didn't narrow, didn't do any of the things normal human eyes did when they found a trembling woman on the floor surrounded by broken things. He just observed, with a precision that felt like being dissected. Linda's fingers scrambled for the broken pieces. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll replace it. Please don't, please. I'll clean it. I'm sorry. A handkerchief appeared in front of her face, white, pressed, monogrammed with initials she couldn't read through her blurred vision. It hung in the air between them, held by a hand that was steady and sure and utterly unbothered by the mess at his feet. Linda stared at it. Then, against every rule Mrs. Park had given her, she looked up. His eyes were already on hers, dark, bottomless, not angry, not kind. Something far more dangerous than either, curious. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The handkerchief said everything. "I see you. I see that you're broken, and I have decided not to break you further." She took the handkerchief with shaking fingers. He turned and walked away. His footsteps made no sound on the marble, like even the floor was afraid to acknowledge him. And Linda knelt there, holding the handkerchief of a man who made people disappear because that's what the city said about anyone who crossed Joe Dongmin, that they simply ceased to exist, and for the first time in 3 months, she stopped crying. Not because the pain was gone, but because something had replaced it. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, knowing the fall would either kill you or teach you how to fly. She didn't know it then, couldn't have known. But that handkerchief was not a kindness. It was a claim. A quiet, deliberate marking by a man who never did anything by accident. Because Joe Dongmin had already read her file. He already knew her name, her history, her heartbreak. He knew who Kevin was. He knew about the breakup, the car she'd been sleeping in, the $3.50 in her bank account the day she'd applied for the position. He knew everything. And now, watching her kneel on his floor, holding his handkerchief to her chest like it was the first gentle thing anyone had given her in months, he felt something crack behind his ribs, something inconvenient, something he hadn't planned for. Outside, the thunder rolled on. Rain hammered the estate's windows like fists, and somewhere in the city, a man named Kevin was pouring champagne for a woman who was not pregnant, celebrating a promotion he didn't deserve. at a company he didn't know was already owned by the same man whose handkerchief his ex-girlfriend was now pressing to her tear-streaked face. The world is full of men who throw women away, but every now and then, one of those women lands at the feet of a monster. And the monster looks down and thinks, mine. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The first week at the Joe estate taught Linda 3 things. First, that silence could be loud. Not the kind of silence you find in libraries or empty churches, but the kind that presses against your eardrums like a hand clamped over your mouth. The mansion had 47 rooms, she knew, because Mrs. Park had handed her a laminated map on her first morning, color-coded by cleaning priority, and every single one of them was quiet in a way that made Linda's skin prickle. No television, no music, no laughter bouncing off the vaulted ceilings, just the tick of antique clocks, the whisper of her own footsteps on hardwood, and occasionally, distantly, the sound of men speaking in Korean behind closed doors. Second, that rich people's houses smelled different. Not like money exactly, but like the absence of struggle. Cedar and leather and something faintly floral that she later learned was a diffuser in the main hallway that cost more than 3 months of her old rent. Everything was polished. Everything gleamed. The floors reflected her face back at her when she knelt to clean them, and sometimes she'd pause and stare at her own reflection, a girl in a maid's uniform, dark skin against white marble, and wonder how she'd ended up inside a painting she was never meant to be part of. Third, and most importantly, that the men who walked these halls were not butlers. She'd noticed them on her very first morning. 2 of them flanking the front entrance, hands clasped in front of them, earpieces curling behind their left ears. Another stationed at the foot of the east staircase, another by the kitchen. They wore dark suits, not as expensive as Dongmin's, but close, and they moved with a kind of controlled stillness that reminded Linda of documentaries about predators, lions resting in the grass. Calm, patient, waiting for a reason not to be. One of them, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, had caught Linda staring on her second day. He hadn't smiled, hadn't frowned. He'd simply looked at her the way you'd look at a fly that had wandered into a room where it didn't belong, and then he'd returned his gaze to the middle distance, dismissing her from existence. She'd asked Mrs. Park about it that evening, while they were folding linens in the service room. The men in the suits, Linda had said carefully. Are they security? Mrs. Park's hands hadn't stopped folding. They are Mr. Joe's associates. Associates. Yes, they carry guns. Mrs. Park had looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something closer to a teacher's patience when a student asks an obvious question. Linda, you applied for a position in the household of Joe Dongmin. Did you think he collected stamps? That had been the end of that conversation, but it hadn't been the end of Linda's unease. Because she'd seen other things too, in those first days. The black cars that arrived at odd hours, disgorging men who entered through a side door she wasn't permitted to clean near. The phone calls Dongmin took in his study, the one she was never allowed to enter, that sometimes lasted hours and sometimes lasted 30 seconds. And the 30-second ones always seemed to leave the house feeling heavier afterward, as if whatever had been decided in those brief words had weight enough to press on the walls. She'd seen the way the gardener, a cheerful old man named Mr. Yoon, who grew roses along the south terrace, went quiet and pale when one of the black cars arrived. She'd seen the way the chef, a woman named Sun Hee who hummed while she cooked, would stop humming whenever footsteps passed the kitchen that weren't part of the regular staff. And she'd seen the room at the end of the east corridor, the one with the reinforced door and the keypad lock and the faint, metallic smell that seeped under the door jamb like a secret. She'd been mopping near it on her 4th day when one of the suited men had materialized behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't heard a single footstep, and said, in accented English, "Not this hallway." She'd moved, quickly, and she hadn't gone back. But the thing that unsettled her most wasn't the guns, or the locked rooms, or the men who moved like shadows. It was the realization, slow and creeping, that she didn't want to leave. Because despite everything, the danger humming beneath the polished surface like electricity under skin, the Joe estate was the first place in months where Linda felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Safe. Nobody yelled here. Nobody slammed doors or threw dishes or told her she wasn't good enough. The work was hard. Yes, her knees ached, her hands were raw from chemicals, and Mrs. Park standards would have made a drill sergeant weep, but there was a structure to it. A rhythm. Wake at 5. Clean the east wing. Polish the banisters. Prepare the dining room. Fold. Sweep. Scrub. Repeat. It was mindless in the way that grief demands mindlessness, and Linda surrendered to it gratefully, letting the repetition fill the hollow place inside her chest where Kevin's voice still echoed sometimes. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she was starting to think she could do this, starting to think she could disappear into this strange, silent world and simply exist. No past, no future, just marble and polish, and the sound of her own breathing. And then came the night everything changed. It was past midnight. A Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had started to blur. Linda had been unable to sleep, so she'd done what she always did when insomnia won. She cleaned. She'd taken her supplies to the main hall and was working on the baseboards near the front entrance when the door opened. No knock, no announcement. Just the heavy oak swinging inward and a gust of cold air that smelled like rain, and something else. Something sharp. Copper. Joe Dong-min stepped inside. He was alone, which was unusual. Linda had never seen him without at least one of his suited shadows. His black overcoat was soaked, hanging heavy off his shoulders. His hair, usually immaculate, was damp and pushed back from his forehead. His tie was loosened. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. And his left hand was pressed against his right side, just below the ribs, and between his fingers, something dark and wet was seeping through the white of his shirt. Blood. Linda froze. The rag fell from her hand and hit the floor with a soft, wet sound. Her brain fired a series of rapid instructions. Run, hide, pretend you didn't see this, go back to your room and lock the door and forget. But her body didn't move. Dong-min hadn't noticed her yet. He was leaning against the doorframe, breathing through his teeth, his eyes closed. For the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't look like a statue. He looked like a man in pain. A man who had walked through his own front door, expecting the house to be empty, expecting to bleed in private, expecting the kind of solitude that powerful men mistake for strength. He opened his eyes, saw her. The silence between them was absolute. Linda waited for the anger, for the cold dismissal, for him to summon one of his men and have her escorted out or worse. Mrs. Park's rules echoed in her head. Don't look him in the eye. You're bleeding, she said. The words left her mouth before she could catch them. Stupid. Obvious. The kind of thing a child would say. But they were out now, hanging in the air between them like the handkerchief had hung days before. Dong-min stared at her. Then, very slowly, he looked down at his own hand, as if noticing the blood for the first time. It's not deep, he said. His voice was low and controlled, but there was a tightness in it that betrayed him. The words cost him something. It's bleeding through your shirt. I said it's not deep. Linda stood up. She didn't know why. Some reflex buried deeper than fear, deeper than common sense. Something inherited from a grandmother who'd been a nurse, and a mother who'd patched up every scraped knee in the neighborhood without once asking how the scrape happened. Sit down, she said. He blinked, just once, but it was the most human reaction she'd ever seen from him. Excuse me? You need to sit down. If it's not deep, then it needs to be cleaned and closed before it gets infected. If it is deep, you need a hospital. Either way, standing in a doorway bleeding on a marble floor isn't helping. She couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. This was a man who made taxi drivers refuse fares, a man whose nickname was a euphemism for death. And she was telling him to sit down like he was a misbehaving child. But something strange happened. The hard line of his mouth shifted. Not a smile, she wasn't sure he knew how to smile, but something adjacent. a crack in the mask, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or might have been shock, or might have been both. He sat down, right there, on the bottom step of the grand staircase, his $1,000 coat pooling around him like spilled ink. He leaned back against the banister and let out a slow breath, and Linda could see now that the wound was on his right side, a clean slash about 4 inches long, bleeding steadily but not gushing, not arterial. She'd seen worse in her old neighborhood. She disappeared into the service room and came back with the first aid kit, a professional grade one, because of course Jo Dong-min's first aid kit would look like it belonged in a field hospital. She knelt beside him, peeled back the ruined shirt with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and cleaned the wound with antiseptic. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes while she worked, her fingers pressing butterfly strips across the wound with a precision she didn't know she possessed. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question. My mother was a nurse. I grew up holding gauze. Your file says you studied hospitality management." "My file." She kept her eyes on the wound. "You read my file. I read everyone's file. Then you know I dropped out after 2 years because I couldn't afford the tuition." "Yes, and you hired me anyway." "I hired you because you were desperate, and desperate people are either loyal or dangerous. I wanted to know which one you were." She finished the last strip and sat back on her heels. Their eyes met. She was breaking the rule again, looking directly at him, but the rule felt absurd now, kneeling on the floor with his blood on her fingers. "And?" she asked. "Which one am I?" He didn't answer. He looked at her hands, small, brown, still stained faintly with antiseptic and blood, and then he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him pause in a way that suggested Jo Dong-min did not pause often. "You didn't run," he said finally. "No, you didn't scream, didn't call the police, didn't ask what happened. It's not my business what happened. Most people would make it their business. Most people would want to know if their employer is the kind of man who comes home at midnight bleeding from a knife wound." Linda met his gaze, held it. "You gave me a handkerchief when I was crying on your floor. I'm not going to leave you bleeding on your stairs." Something quiet and tectonic moved behind his eyes, like a fault line shifting deep underground. He stood slowly, carefully, one hand bracing against the banister, and looked down at her from his full height. "Go to sleep, Linda," he said. And then he walked up the stairs and disappeared into the dark upper floors, and she was left kneeling on the marble with a bloodied first aid kit, and the strange, electric feeling that she had just passed a test she didn't know she was taking. After that night, things changed. Small things, at first. So small that Linda almost convinced herself she was imagining them. Her room, a modest servant's quarter on the ground floor with a single bed and a window that looked onto the garden wall, was upgraded. She came back from her afternoon shift to find the thin mattress replaced with something thick and soft, the kind that cradled your body like an apology. New sheets. Egyptian cotton, if she had to guess, because they felt like sleeping inside a cloud. A reading lamp on the nightstand that hadn't been there before. A small vase of fresh peonies, her favorite flower, though she couldn't remember telling anyone that. Then the meals changed. The staff ate together in the kitchen. Simple food prepared by Sun-hee rice, soup, whatever was efficient. But Linda started finding extras on her plate. Jollof rice one evening, seasoned exactly the way her mother used to make it. Fried plantain the next morning, golden and crisp. A slice of red velvet cake, her weakness since childhood, appearing on her nightstand one Sunday afternoon with no note, no explanation. She'd gone to Sun-hee confused. "The chef doesn't explain," Sun-hee had said, not looking up from her chopping board. "The chef is told what to cook. The chef cooks." Told by who? Sun-hee's knife had paused. She'd glanced toward the ceiling, toward the upper floors, toward the rooms Linda wasn't allowed to enter, and then resumed chopping without another word. Linda's old debts began to disappear. The credit card she'd maxed out during her last months with Kevin, the one that called her 3 times a day with automated threats, stopped calling. When she finally checked her balance, it read 0. Not 0 as in empty, 0 as in cleared. Paid. Gone. A debt she'd been drowning under for 2 years, erased like a pencil mark. She hadn't asked for any of it, hadn't mentioned the debt, the flowers, the food, but someone knew. Someone was paying attention to the small, private details of her life with a thoroughness that should have terrified her. And it did. A little. But mostly it made her feel something she hadn't felt since before Kevin. Something warm and disorienting, like stepping into sunlight after months in a basement. Seen. She felt seen. Not the way Kevin had seen her as a reflection of his own ambition, a mirror he'd eventually outgrown, but seen the way you see something valuable, something worth protecting, something worth the effort of learning that she liked peonies. That jollof rice made her close her eyes and smile. That red velvet cake could make her cry if she ate it slowly enough and thought about her mother. She caught Dongmin watching her once. Just once. She'd been in the library dusting, always dusting, and she'd looked up and he was standing in the doorway, a cup of tea in his hand, his expression as unreadable as ever. But his eyes were different. Softer, maybe. Or maybe that was just the light. He'd left without speaking, and Linda had stood there with her duster and her racing heart and thought, I am in so much trouble. The trouble arrived 8 weeks into her employment, wearing a wrinkled gray shirt and the ghost of a man she used to love. It was a Saturday afternoon. Linda was trimming dead heads off Mrs. Park's rose bushes near the front gate, a task she'd volunteered for because the fresh air helped quiet her mind when the intercom buzzed. She wouldn't have thought anything of it. Deliveries came regularly, and the guards handled them, but this time, through the iron bars of the gate, she saw him, Kevin. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she registered, and she hated herself for how satisfying it was. His shirt was untucked, wrinkled, the collar stained with something yellowish. His slacks were creased in the wrong places. His shoes, the Italian leather ones he'd been so proud of, were scuffed and dull. His hair, once gelled into corporate perfection, hung limp across his forehead. He had the hollow-cheeked, red-eyed look of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He saw her through the gate and his face crumpled. Linda. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Linda, please. I need to talk to you. Her hands tightened on the pruning shears. The roses blurred. Somewhere behind her, she could feel the weight of the house, the guards, the cameras, the silent machinery of Dong Min's world pressing at her back like a hand on her shoulder. You shouldn't be here, Kevin. I know. But please, just 5 minutes. I made a mistake, Linda. The biggest mistake of my life. It wasn't what I thought. None of it was. I was stupid and I was wrong and His voice broke. He gripped the iron bars with both hands. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. 3 months ago, those words would have broken her. 3 months ago, she would have opened the gate, pulled him inside, pressed her face into his chest, and forgiven him before he finished the sentence. Because that's what Linda Cray did. She forgave. She bent. She made herself small enough to fit into whatever space someone else left for her. But 3 months ago, she hadn't been sleeping in Egyptian cotton sheets in a dead man's house. She hadn't felt the weight of a handkerchief offered without judgment. She hadn't knelt on a marble floor and stitched a monster's wound and been looked at, really looked at by someone who saw her not as a convenience, but as something worth knowing. Kevin, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. You need to leave. Linda, please. The guards will escort you out if you don't. His face twisted. Desperation curdled into something uglier, a flash of the entitlement she'd been too in love to notice for 4 years. You can't do this. You can't just you work here, Linda. You're a maid. You clean floors. You don't get to stand behind a gate and... Sir. One of Dongmin's men materialized beside the gate, the one with the scarred eyebrow. His hand rested lightly at his waist. You need to leave the premises. Kevin's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the guard, then at Linda, then back at the guard. And whatever he saw in the man's eyes made him take a step back. This isn't over, he said. Not to the guard. To Linda. I'll come back. I'll make this right. He walked away. But he didn't look like a man leaving. He looked like a man regrouping. Linda went inside. She made it to the service room before her legs gave out. and she sat on the cold tile floor with her back against the washing machine and her hands over her mouth and shook. He came back 4 days later. It was raining. Of course it was raining. The universe had a sick sense of poetry when it came to Linda Cray and water falling from the sky. He was standing outside the gate again, but this time he wasn't gripping the bars. He was on his knees. On the wet asphalt of the private road, in the rain, with his soaked gray shirt clinging to his skin and his hands extended in front of him like a man praying to a god he'd only just discovered. Linda saw him from the window of the service room and felt something crack inside her chest. Not love, not anymore, but memory. The echo of a time when that face had meant safety, when those hands had meant home, when kneeling would have been an act of devotion and not desperation. She grabbed a jacket and walked out. The rain hit her immediately. Cold, relentless. It plastered her uniform to her body and pulled strands of hair loose from her bun, and she was back on that sidewalk outside the restaurant, soaking wet and watching taillights disappear. Every version of herself that had ever stood in the rain, waiting for a man who wasn't coming back, except now she was the one approaching, and he was the one on his knees. "Get up, Kevin. Not until you listen to me." His voice was raw, gutted. "I lost everything, Linda. The promotion, the apartment, her." She left. She was never, it was all. He dragged his wet hands down his face. "You were the only real thing I ever had, and I threw you away. I threw you away like you were nothing, and you were everything, and I can't. Kevin, get up and go home." "I don't have a home." He looked up at her, and his eyes were red and swollen and full of the kind of pain that would have gutted her once. "Please, just give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll be anything you need me to," she said to leave. The voice came from behind Linda. Low, quiet, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume because it has never once been questioned. Linda turned. Jo Dong-min stood at the gate, holding a large black umbrella. He was wearing his usual uniform of devastation, black suit, white shirt, black tie, not a single crease despite the weather, and his expression was the one Linda had come to recognize as his default, carved from stone, revealing nothing, concealing everything, but his eyes. His eyes were fixed on Kevin with a precision that made the rain feel warm by comparison. He walked forward, past the gate, past the guards, who parted for him like water around a blade. He didn't stop until he was standing directly beside Linda, and then, with a deliberateness that turned a simple gesture into a declaration, he shifted the umbrella so that it covered her entirely. His left shoulder caught the rain. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. Kevin, still on his knees, looked up at the man standing above him. And Linda watched the exact moment comprehension arrived, watched Kevin's eyes travel from the tailored suit to the polished shoes to the face that belonged on a wanted poster or a magazine cover, depending on which side of the law you stood on, and she watched the color drain from his face like water from a cracked glass. Who are you?" Kevin stammered. Dong-min didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked at Kevin the way a man looks at something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his shoe, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, terrifyingly soft, the kind of soft that comes right before something breaks. "She is not your servant," he said. "She is my responsibility." The words hit the air like a gavel. Final, absolute, not a statement of employment, not a clarification of roles. A claim. The same kind of claim as the handkerchief, as the paid debts, as the peonies on her nightstand, quiet, deliberate, and utterly non-negotiable. Kevin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Linda, you don't know you don't know who this—" "She knows exactly who I am." Dong-min's gaze didn't waver. "The question is whether you do, and whether you understand what it means to be kneeling in front of my house, harassing someone under my protection." The rain hammered down. The black Mercedes idled behind them, headlights cutting through the mist like eyes. The guards stood motionless, watching. Kevin looked at Linda. One last time, searching for the girl who would have bent, The girl who would have folded. The girl who defined her worth by his willingness to stay. But that girl was standing under an umbrella held by a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. Linda looked back at Kevin and felt nothing. Not love, not hate, not even pity, just the quiet, bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Kevin got to his feet, slowly, wet and shaking, and diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with the realization that the woman he'd discarded had been picked up by hands far more powerful than his. He walked away. Into the rain, into the dark, into whatever was waiting for him out there. And Linda stood under the umbrella, close enough to Dong Min to feel the warmth radiating off his body, and she didn't move, didn't speak. Just let the rain fall on one side and the silence settle on the other, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a maid or a victim or a woman who'd been left in the rain. She felt like someone worth standing in the rain for. Dong Min looked down at her. She looked up at him, and in the narrow, dry space between them, sheltered by black fabric and something far stronger than an umbrella, something wordless passed, an understanding, a shift. The kind of moment that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with music or fireworks, but that rearranges everything quietly, the way dawn changes a landscape without making a sound. He didn't say anything else. He simply turned, kept the umbrella over her, and walked her back inside. The gate closed behind them. And somewhere in the rain, growing smaller with every step, a man who had once called her just a maid was learning what it felt like to be nothing at all. He came back a third time. Not to the gate. Not in the open, where the cameras could see him and the guards could intercept him. Kevin had learned that much, at least. Desperation, Linda was discovering, made people either stupid or cunning, and Kevin had apparently chosen cunning, which was worse because it meant he was thinking, and a thinking Kevin was a Kevin with a plan. He found her at the grocery store. Mrs. Park sent Linda into town every Thursday to pick up specialty items. The regular deliveries didn't cover a specific brand of gochugaru, fresh perilla leaves. The New Zealand butter Sun, he insisted, was the only butter worth cooking with. It was the 1 hour each week Linda existed outside the estate's iron bubble, and she'd come to cherish it. The normalcy of it. Pushing a cart through fluorescent aisles, squeezing avocados, reading the backs of cereal boxes like a person with a regular life. She was reaching for a jar of sesame oil when a hand closed around her wrist. She didn't scream. The estate had trained that out of her. Instead, she went very still, the way Mrs. Park's roses went still when the wind dropped, and she turned her head and found Kevin standing behind her, pressed into the narrow aisle like he was trying to make himself invisible. He looked worse than before. Not disheveled this time, destroyed. His cheeks were hollow. There was a bruise yellowing along his jawline, and a cut above his right eye that had been closed with tape instead of stitches. His hands were shaking. Not the trembling of emotion, like at the gate, the shaking of fear. "Don't make a scene," he whispered. "Please, they're watching." "Who's watching?" "The people I owe money to, Linda. The people who are going to kill me." She pulled her wrist free. "Kevin, I can't help you. I told you." "You can." His eyes were wild, wet. The eyes of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't come back from. "There's a file. In his office. In the study you're not supposed to enter. A red ledger, or a folder, I don't know exactly, but it has names. Accounts. Routes. The people I owe, they want it. They said if I bring it to them, we're even. My debt disappears. I disappear. I go somewhere far away and I never bother you again." Linda stared at him. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. A woman pushed a cart past the end of the aisle, oblivious. "You want me to steal from Joe Dong Min. I want you to save my life. By stealing from a man who could end mine." Kevin's face crumbled. The mask of desperation slipped, and underneath it was something naked and ugly, the raw, animal terror of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "Linda, you don't understand. These people, the Golden Vipers, they don't negotiate. They don't give extensions. They gave me a deadline. If I don't deliver that file, they'll..." He drew a finger across his throat. The gesture was almost cartoonish, but the fear in his eyes was not. How did you even get involved with people like that? He looked away. The woman. The one I left you for. She wasn't. It was a setup, Linda. She was working for them. They used her to get to me, and they used me to get to him. To your boss. It was never about us. It was always about getting inside that house. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. The woman was never pregnant. The breakup wasn't personal. Kevin hadn't left Linda because she wasn't good enough. He'd left because someone had placed a prettier trap in his path, and he'd walked into it with his eyes closed and his ego wide open. It should have made her feel better. It didn't. I can't do this, Kevin. You're the only one who can. You're inside. You have access. 5 minutes in his study, that's all I'm asking. He'll never know. But that was where Kevin was wrong. About so many things, but especially about that, because Jo Dong-min always knew. Linda left the store without the sesame oil. She drove back to the estate, with her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and Kevin's terrified face burned into her retinas, and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her chest like a stone slab. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. She lay in her Egyptian cotton sheets and stared at the ceiling, and ran the math of loyalty in her head until the numbers stopped making sense. Kevin was a selfish, shallow man who had thrown her away like garbage. Kevin was also a human being who was going to die if she didn't help him. Dong-min was a man who had shown her more quiet kindness in 2 months than Kevin had managed in 4 years. Dong-min was also a man whose study she wasn't allowed to enter, whose business she wasn't allowed to question, whose world operated on rules that ended with people disappearing. On the 3rd night, she got out of bed. She moved through the house like a ghost, past the sleeping service quarters, past the kitchen, where the clock ticked like a metronome, up the east staircase, her bare feet silent on the marble, down the corridor she'd been told to avoid, past the room with the reinforced door, to the private study at the end of the hall. The keypad glowed green. Unlocked. That should have been her first warning. Jo Dong-min did not leave doors unlocked by accident, the same way he did not leave handkerchiefs by accident, the same way he did not do anything by accident. But Linda's heart was pounding so loud it drowned out every instinct screaming at her to stop. She opened the door. The study was smaller than she'd expected. Dark wood, leather chair, a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. Bookshelves lined every wall, but the books weren't decorative, they were worn, read, annotated. And there, on the desk, illuminated by a single brass lamp that had no business being on at 3 a.m, was a manila folder. No label, no lock, just sitting there, waiting. She picked it up, opened it. Pages of names, numbers, account routes, the language of money moving through channels that didn't appear on any map. She didn't understand most of it. She didn't need to. She just needed to take it to Kevin and let him take it to the people who wanted him dead and let the whole ugly equation balance itself out. She closed the folder, held it against her chest, turned toward the door, and couldn't move. Not because someone was blocking her way, not because an alarm had sounded or a guard had appeared. She couldn't move because her feet had become anchored to the carpet by something heavier than fear, by the memory of a handkerchief offered without judgment, by peonies on a nightstand, by a man who had stood in the rain and held an umbrella over her and let his own shoulder get wet, by the words, "She is my responsibility," spoken in a voice that turned protection into something sacred. She stood in that study for 11 minutes. She knew because the desk clock ticked every second, and she counted all 660 of them. And in those 11 minutes, Linda Cray fought the final battle of the woman she used to be versus the woman she was becoming. And when it was over, when the 661st second arrived, she put the folder back on the desk. Then she walked out of the study, down the corridor, down the stairs, and straight to the east wing, where she knew Dong-min's private quarters were. And she knocked on his door at 3:15 in the morning with the taste of adrenaline still metallic on her tongue. He opened the door like he'd been expecting her. He was still dressed, shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, no tie, reading glasses pushed up into his hair, which was the most human she'd ever seen him look. Behind him, she could see a desk covered in papers and the blue glow of a laptop screen. I went into your study, she said. No preamble, no excuse. Kevin came to me. He's in debt to a gang called the Golden Vipers. They want your file, the one on your desk. He asked me to steal it. I went in. I picked it up. She swallowed, and I put it back. Dongmin leaned against the doorframe, crossed his arms, looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, but then again, she'd never been able to read him, and she was starting to suspect that was the point. I know, he said. 2 words, delivered with the same calm he used for everything. The same calm he'd had with the handkerchief, with the umbrella, with the blood on his shirt and her hands on his wound. You know? The keypad logs every entry. The study has 4 cameras. I received an alert on my phone the moment you opened the door. He paused. I watched you stand there for 11 minutes, Linda. I watched you hold the file, and I watched you put it back. The ground tilted. Or maybe that was just Linda's understanding of reality shifting beneath her. You left it unlocked on purpose. Yes, you wanted to see what I would do. I needed to see what you would do. There is a difference. And if I had taken it? If I had walked out and given it to Kevin? His expression didn't change, but something in his voice did a hairline fracture in the granite. Then I would have been wrong about you, and I am not often wrong. She should have been angry. She should have felt manipulated, tested, used the same way Kevin had used her, the same way the Golden Vipers had used Kevin. But standing in the doorway of Dongmin's room at 3 a.m, exhausted and shaking and stripped down to something raw and true, Linda didn't feel manipulated. She felt trusted, because the test hadn't been whether she would steal the file. The test had been whether she would come to him afterward, whether she would choose honesty over self-preservation, whether she would trust him with the truth, even when the truth made her vulnerable, and she had. Kevin is going to die, she said quietly. If those people don't get what they want. Dongmin's eyes softened. Just a fraction. Just enough. Kevin is not going to die, he said. I have a use for Kevin. And I have a use for that file. He stepped back from the doorway. Go to sleep, Linda. And tomorrow, don't clean the East Wing. You'll want to stay away from it for a few days. She went to sleep, or tried to. What happened next? She learned in fragments. Whispered conversations between guards she wasn't supposed to overhear. A phone call Mrs. Park took in the linen room with the door not quite closed. The expression on Sun Hee's face the morning after, not fear exactly, but the careful blankness of someone who knew something they wished they didn't. Dongmin moved the file, not to a safe or a vault, but to a location, a warehouse on the waterfront, that he owned through 3 layers of shell companies. Then he made sure Kevin knew where it was. Not directly, through channels. Breadcrumbs laid with the precision of a man who had been engineering outcomes since before Linda was born. Kevin, predictable as gravity, told the Golden Vipers. And the Golden Vipers, hungry and arrogant, and convinced they were walking into an empty building with an unguarded prize, mobilized. They brought 12 men. Dongmin brought 4. The arithmetic didn't seem to favor him. But Linda was learning that Dongmin's math operated on different principles than other people's principles, that accounted for variables like training, loyalty, and the kind of cold, surgical violence that turned quantity into an irrelevance. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was absolutely, explicitly not supposed to be there. Dongmin had told her to stay at the estate. Mrs. Park had locked the service entrance. The guards had been given her photograph with instructions not to let her leave. But Linda had spent her whole life being told where she could and couldn't go, and she was done. She took the gardener's truck. Mr. Yoon left the keys in the ignition because he was 73 and trusting and didn't expect the maid to steal his pickup on a Tuesday night. She drove to the waterfront address she'd overheard through Mrs. Park's not-quite-closed door and arrived just as the sky opened up. She would learn later that Dongmin had known she would come, that he'd left Mr. Yoon's truck untouched on purpose, that the one exit Mrs. Park hadn't sealed was the garden gate near the rose bushes, Linda's favorite spot, because Jo Dongmin never did anything by accident, and if Linda was going to choose him, he needed her to choose with her eyes open. He needed her to see what he was, all of it, not just the handkerchiefs and the peonies, but the blood. Rain. Again. Always rain. As if the universe had decided that every pivotal moment in Linda Cray's life would be accompanied by water falling from the sky like a biblical judgment. The warehouse was a long, low building, squatting at the edge of the dock. Through the rain, she could see vehicles, black SUVs she didn't recognize, and Dongmin's Mercedes parked at an angle that suggested urgency. The loading bay door was open. Light spilled out. And sounds. Sounds she would remember for the rest of her life. She didn't go in through the front. Some instinct, or maybe the ghost of Mrs. Park's voice saying, "Stay alive, stupid girl," guided her to a side door. It was unlocked. She slipped inside and pressed herself against the wall behind a stack of shipping crates, and from there she saw everything. The Golden Vipers had arrived expecting a filing cabinet and an empty room. What they'd found was Joe Dongmin standing in the center of the warehouse floor, hands in his pockets, flanked by 4 men who moved like extensions of his will. The fight, if it could be called, that was already in its final act. Bodies on the concrete, some still, some groaning. The Vipers had brought guns, but Dongmin's men had brought something more dangerous. Preparation. The warehouse was their ground. Every sightline, every shadow, every exit had been accounted for. The Vipers had walked into a kill box disguised as an opportunity, and by the time they realized it, half of them were already down. Dongmin himself had shed his jacket. His white shirt was spattered with red not his own. Linda somehow knew, and his sleeves were rolled to his forearms. He moved with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. Economical, precise, no wasted motion. Every strike landed where it was meant to. Every step carried him exactly where he needed to be. He fought the way he did everything else, with terrifying, methodical control. The last Viper, standing a thick-necked man with a gold chain and a look of dawning comprehension, raised his gun. Dongmin crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, redirected the barrel with one hand, and put the man on the ground with a single blow that echoed off the corrugated walls like a thunderclap. Then silence, broken only by rain drumming on the roof and the ragged breathing of men who had made the mistake of thinking they were the predators. That's when Kevin emerged. He'd been hiding. Behind the same crates Linda was pressed against, 20 feet from her, invisible until the violence ended and the survival math changed. He stepped out with his hands raised and his face the color of wet cement, and Linda saw him see the aftermath, the bodies, the blood, the man standing in the middle of it all like a conductor who'd just finished a symphony, and she watched something final break behind Kevin's eyes. Dongmin turned, saw Kevin. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked bored. "The informant," he said. "Not a question." Kevin's mouth worked. "I didn't. I was forced, they made me. You sold information about my household to a rival organization. You attempted to use a woman under my protection as your accomplice. And now you're standing in my warehouse, surrounded by the consequences of your decisions, telling me you were forced." Dongmin tilted his head. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Kevin's eyes darted, searching for an exit, finding none. And then Linda would replay this moment in her mind for years, would hold it up to the light and examine it from every angle, and it would never stop hurting. His gaze landed on her. She saw the calculation happen in real time, saw the fear curdle into something desperate and selfish and survivalist, saw him lunge toward her before her body could react. His hand closed around her arm. He yanked her in front of him like a shield, like a bargaining chip, like a thing and not a person, and pressed his back against the wall. "You won't touch me," Kevin said, his voice cracking, his fingers digging into Linda's arm hard enough to bruise. "Not while I have her. You care about her, I've seen it. You won't risk." "Kevin!" Linda's voice was calm, calmer than she'd expected. Calmer than she had any right to be, with his fingers bruising her arm and his breath hot and panicked against the back of her neck. "Let go." "Shut up. Shut up, Linda. This is the only way." "This is the only way what?" "The only way you survive. Using me as a human shield is your plan. This is what 4 years together meant to you. I'm trying to save us both." "You're trying to save yourself, the way you always have, The way you saved yourself at that restaurant when you left me in the rain. The way you saved yourself when you let a stranger into your bed because she fit your lifestyle. You have never, not once, put anyone above yourself, and you're not starting now. You're just running out of people to hide behind. Kevin's grip tightened, then loosened, because across the warehouse, Jo Dong-min was walking toward them, not running, not charging, walking, with the unhurried precision of a man who has never in his life needed to rush because the outcome has never once been in doubt. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Linda could see the rain still glistening on his hair, close enough that she could see the blood on his knuckles and the absolute, glacial stillness in his eyes. "Remove your hand," Dong-min said, "or I will remove it for you." 7 words, delivered without inflection, without heat, without any of the theatrical menace that lesser men relied on. Just a statement of fact, delivered by a man who had never made a threat he didn't intend to fulfill. Kevin's hand fell away from Linda's arm. She stepped forward, away from Kevin, toward Dong-min, toward the blood and the violence and the rain hammering against the loading bay and the terrifying, beautiful certainty that she was choosing the monster, not because she was blind to what he was, but because she had finally learned the difference between a man who holds you back and a man who holds an umbrella over your head while his own shoulder gets wet. She stopped in front of Dong-min, looked up at him. He looked down at her, and in his eyes, those dark, fathomless eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Fear, not of the vipers, not of Kevin, not of the blood on his hands, or the empire of shadows he'd built. Fear of her. Fear that she would look at what he'd done, the violence, the calculated brutality, the precise and merciless dismantling of 12 men, and see only the monster. Fear that she would run. She didn't run. She reached up and wiped a streak of blood from his cheek with her thumb. His jaw clenched, his breath caught. And for one fraction of a second, the mask cracked completely, and she saw him not the gentleman, not the Mafia boss, not the man the city whispered about in locked rooms, but Dong-min, just Dong-min, lonely and terrified and hoping. "You're hurt," she said softly. The corner of his mouth twitched. The ghost of something that might, in another life, have been a smile, not in any way that needs stitches. I wasn't talking about stitches. Behind them, the guards dealt with Kevin. She didn't watch, didn't need to. She heard his protests grow distant as they marched him toward the loading bay, toward the authorities. She would learn later, because Dong-min had called them himself, an anonymous tip timed to the minute, ensuring Kevin would face justice rather than disappearance, which was more mercy than most men in Dong-min's position would have offered. And the last thing she heard from the man who had once told her she was just a maid was the sound of his voice cracking on a word that might have been her name, swallowed by rain and distance and the finality of consequences. The drive back to the estate was silent. Not the tense silence of the mansion's hallways or the loaded silence of Dong-min's study. A different kind. The kind that exists between two people who have seen each other completely and decided to stay. Mrs. Park was waiting at the door. She took one look at Linda, wet, bruised, with blood on her thumb that wasn't hers, and pressed her lips into a line that might have been disapproval or might have been relief. She handed Linda a towel and disappeared without a word. Dong-min led her to the study, the real one, not the decoy he'd left unlocked. A smaller room behind the bookshelf, because of course there was a room behind the bookshelf with a fireplace already lit and 2 chairs angled toward the warmth. He poured 2 glasses of something amber, handed her one, sat down across from her. The fire crackled. Rain tapped against the windows. And the silence stretched. Not uncomfortably, but the way silence stretches between people who have too much to say and all the time in the world to say it. "The woman," Linda said finally. "The one Kevin left me for. She was working for the Vipers." "Yes." "She was never pregnant." "No." "She was a professional, placed specifically to compromise Kevin and, through him, to gain access to my operations." Linda's hand tightened around her glass. She stared into the amber liquid and felt the word detonate inside her chest the way it had that night in the restaurant. Expecting. The word that had made her feel replaceable. The word that had turned 4 years of love into a footnote, and now she was learning it had been a fabrication, a script, a lie designed not even to hurt her, but to move a pawn on a board she hadn't known existed. The cruelty of it wasn't that Kevin had left her for a pregnant woman. It was that there had never been a pregnant woman at all. She'd grieved a ghost. She'd hated herself for not being enough to compete with a family that never existed. All those nights in her car, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel, whispering she's expecting. She's expecting like a prayer for the knife to stop twisting, and the knife had been made of air. And Kevin's dead? She asked, when she could trust her voice again. Manufactured. Inflated to ensure his compliance. He owed them money, yes, but a fraction of what they claimed. The rest was leverage. Linda stared into the fire. So the entire breakup, the restaurant, the rain, all of it was engineered. The breakup was Kevin's choice. He is weak and vain and easily manipulated, but he chose to leave you. That part was real. The Vipers simply made sure there was someone waiting to catch him when he did. She took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned. She let it. You knew all of this before you hired me. Yes. You own the company Kevin works for. I own the company Kevin worked for. Past tense. His employment was terminated this morning. Linda set her glass down. The words she'd been holding back since the study, since the file, since the unlocked keypad, pushed their way to the surface. You own the company. You could have fired Kevin the day he left me. You could have crushed him without lifting a finger. Instead, you hired me his ex-girlfriend, put me in your house, put me in a maid's uniform, and watched to see what I would do. She held his gaze. Why not just deal with Kevin directly? Why bring me into it at all? Dongmin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual armor. Because Kevin was not the threat. Kevin was the symptom. The Golden Vipers had already placed one operative inside his life, the woman. I needed to know if they had placed another. If you were bitter enough, broken enough, to be turned against me, hiring you was not cruelty, Linda. It was the only way to know if you were safe. And if I hadn't been, if I'd been working for them, then you would never have seen the inside of this room. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw. But you would have walked away unharmed. That was always the plan. Hurting you was never one of the variables. But falling for me was... No. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask wasn't cracking. It was simply gone. That was never a variable. That was a catastrophe. The almost smile returned. And this time, Linda smiled back. Then, were you wrong about this? She held his gaze. About whatever this is? Between us? Was that in the plan? No, he said. You were not in the plan. The handkerchief was protocol. The upgraded room was management. The paid debts were strategic investment. But standing in the rain holding an umbrella over a woman in a maid's uniform while her pathetic ex-boyfriend knelt on my driveway, the almost smile deepened. That was not in any plan I have ever made. So what was it? He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. The rain sang. And then he said, very simply, "It was the first time I have done something without knowing the outcome." Linda set down her glass. You're telling me that the most powerful man in this city, the man who engineers traps and reads files and anticipates betrayals before they happen, didn't know what he was doing when he held an umbrella over my head? I am telling you that I have controlled every variable in my life since I was 17 years old, and you are the first variable I have no interest in controlling. The words hung in the air between them. Warm, heavy, true. Dongmin reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table between them. Thick, sealed. Linda didn't need to open it to know what was inside. There is enough in there to start over, he said. A new city. A new name, if you want it. An apartment. A year's salary while you decide what you want to do with your life. It's yours regardless of what you choose next. And my other option? He held her gaze. Stay. As your maid? As whatever you want to be. But not as my maid. I think we are past that. Linda looked at the envelope. Then at the fire. Then at the man sitting across from her, this impossible, terrifying, gentle, Violent, lonely, brilliant man who had watched her steal from him and chosen to trust her, who had stood in the rain and let his shoulder get wet, who had killed 12 men and then been afraid she would run. She thought about the restaurant, the rain, the taillights, the $12 dress. She thought about the marble staircase and Mrs. Park's rules and the handkerchief and the porcelain shattering like the sound of one life ending and another beginning. She thought about Kevin, on his knees, offering her nothing but the same emptiness dressed in different clothes. And she thought about Dongmin, standing in the rain, umbrella tilted toward her, shoulder getting wet. She left the envelope on the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, sure, steady, the way they'd held the umbrella, the way they'd held the handkerchief, the way they held everything that mattered to him carefully, deliberately, and with the full understanding that some things, once claimed, become your responsibility forever. The fire crackled. The rain softened to a whisper. And in a hidden room behind a bookshelf in a mansion at the edge of a city that feared the man sitting across from her, Linda Cray, former maid, former girlfriend, former woman left in the rain, made the only choice that had ever truly been hers. She stayed. Not as a servant, not as a project, not as a test, or a variable, or a strategic investment, but as the woman who had stitched a monster's wound and seen the man underneath, the woman who had stolen his secrets and returned them, the woman who had chosen him blood, rain, darkness, and all. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Park was folding linens. Sun Hee was preparing breakfast. The guards were changing shifts. The world outside was waking up to a city that had no idea the balance of power had just shifted, not in a boardroom or a warehouse, but in a quiet room with a fireplace and two people who had found each other in the last place either of them had thought to look. Linda's maid uniform hung in her closet. She would never wear it again. And for the first time since she could remember, she didn't kneel. She sat beside a king, as an equal, with her hand in his and the rain finally, mercifully, beginning to stop. Some women are thrown away. Some women are found. And some women, the rare, resilient, stubborn, extraordinary ones, are both. Can Linda really trust a man the whole city fears? And what will happen now that the Golden Vipers know her face? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what happens next. This story is about to get even darker. Drop a comment. Do you think Linda made the right choice staying with the most dangerous man in the city? Like this video if you're obsessed with this forbidden romance between a maid and a mafia boss that keeps getting more intense. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for what comes knocking at the estate gates. See you in the next one.